Good afternoon. My name is Ishani Premaratna, and I'm a senior in Mather House studying anthropology and global health and health policy. I come from the Commonwealth of Virginia, the home state of President Drew Faust.
And my name is Max Yakubovich. I'm a sophomore in Cabot House, and I'm concentrating in applied math. I come from Oregon, the home state of Nick Kristof.
Drew Gilpin Faust is the 28th president of Harvard, and, significantly, the first Southerner in the university's history to hold this post. She is also the Lincoln Professor of History in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. In 2007, she became president of Harvard University. During her tenure as president, she has broadened the university's international reach, raised the profile of the arts on campus, embraced sustainability, launched edX, the online learning partnership with MIT, and promoted collaboration across academic disciplines and administrative units as she guided the university through a period of significant financial challenges. And still, amidst her many accomplishments, what first comes to mind for me when I think about President Faust are the ways in which she has enhanced and strengthened community on this campus. Since my days as a wide-eyed freshman from Virginia to now, as I stand at the beginning of my senior year, I know that I have seen this campus transformed by a president who understands that to create community, you must first create the physical spaces necessary to nurture it. As we sit here today, we are part of yet another example of this shining tradition at Harvard.
Nicholas Kristof was born in Chicago, but grew up on a farm in Yamhill, Oregon. He entered Harvard College in 1978 as a member of the class of 1982, and while he graduated magna cum laude in 1981, he still considers himself a proud member of the class of 1982. At the college, he concentrated in government and wrote for the Crimson. After graduation, he studied law at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. In 1984, he started working for the New York Times, first as a correspondent, then an associate managing editor, and since 2001 as a columnist. He has won the Pulitzer Prize twice and is author with his wife Cheryl Wudunn of 4 books, most recently A Path Appears, Transforming Lives, Creating Opportunity, which will be published later this month. Since 2010, he has served as a member of Harvard's Board of Overseers. Please join us in welcoming President Drew Faust and Mr. Nick Kristof to the stage.
Thanks so much, Max and Ishana. And thank you all so much for coming today. We're going to try not to inflict too much feedback on you. We try to be attentive to human rights of everybody. I'm going to start off by asking some questions, but I do want to get some feedback from you about questions. And so if you have your phones on you, then if you email questions you'd like me to ask to questions@harvard.edu, then those will be gathered up and passed on to me halfway through this. So give me some help here, okay? And let me start off. Drew, I've read so many profiles of you, but there's one kind of basic thing about you that I have no idea of, and that has to do with the fact that you were never in this role as a freshman here. You came from a family that had lots of ties to a certain university in New Jersey, located in Princeton, and but you went to Bryn Mawr. They were not accepting women then. So I have to ask, did you apply to Harvard?
Well, first I should clarify, had I applied, it would have been to Radcliffe.
To Radcliffe.
No, I applied early decision to Bryn Mawr College. It was binding early decision. That was the only college application I filled out.
I was a little nervous about asking that question because I thought it would either raise questions about the admissions office judgment
or mine.
Or
well,
worse.
It's just mine, right?
But
it raised questions about
but I guess the outreach didn't reach you.
Well, the new dean of the college, Rakesh Khurana, in his address at convocation for the freshmen, got up and said that he had never gotten into Harvard. He'd gone elsewhere. But we really think he's made up for it since. But that was his welcoming message to the freshmen.
I'm curious, how many folks here are freshmen? Okay. I think for a lot of undergraduates these days, there is some thought about basic choices about the humanities versus other areas. And vis-a-vis, the FOG is being renovated now, and I think probably a lot of students who would like to major in art history or philosophy or whatever it may be getting some feedback from parents that if they do that, they're going to end up being the dog walkers for those who are doing computer science. And I wonder what advice you have to those students who feel a little bit torn about that. Many of the students who come to Harvard planning to major in the humanities end up actually concentrating in something else. So what advice do you have for those students?
Well, this has been such an issue in the public discourse in recent years that I've begun asking people as I meet them in life what they majored in, concentrated in college. And what I found is extraordinary numbers of important leaders in this country and elsewhere have come from humanities backgrounds. For example, I was in Davos last year and I met with the mayor of London, and he told me that he had figured out how to straighten out London transport based on his work in classics as an undergraduate, movement around spaces and cities. I thought that was a wonderful story. In our own alumni body, Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, his passion is history. And he has named a chair in the history department because that is something that has always meant so much to him. By the way, I know history is a social science here, but I'm a historian and I regard it as essential to the humanities, just in case someone wants to editorialize on that. When I was at a dinner in Washington a couple of years ago with a senator, a major journalist, the national security advisor to the president, they all talked about their humanities backgrounds. So what we see here, it seems to me, is exactly the argument I'd like to make about the humanities, which is it gives you a basis for thinking, for judgment, for adaptability. We see Steve Jobs talking about the essential nature of the humanities merging with technology and the vision that became Apple. So whatever realm of life you may want to go into, the humanities give you such an important set of perspectives. And as we see the world in upheaval now, how do we understand all these cultures and nations and languages around the world? You must see this necessity. You've written about it yourself in a recent column. It is so fundamental to making a world in which human beings can understand what the future might look like because they understand the context in which they're living their lives and the context that came from.
So your advice to those students is plow on.
Is plow on, that you are not restricted in your job choices by what you do here, that you will have tools and approaches to the world that will be invaluable.
And what advice do you have on kind of student engagement? And I should say that I have a Harvard friend who has favorite facts about people, and my favorite fact about you is that when you were an undergraduate, you skipped your midterms and fled off down to Selma to where the civil rights movement was at a crisis point to try to help the movement, and presumably would have caused a scandal in your family if your parents had actually known about it. That was an incredibly rebellious as well as brave thing to do. I wonder what advice do you have as a one-time student rebel and activist yourself to students today?
Well, if I say skip your midterms, I'll never hear the end of it from the faculty, so I don't want to give that as advice. But I have always felt that I had the great privilege of growing up in the 1960s, or actually college. I grew up before the 1960s, but I was in college in the 1960s. And that was a time when certain issues seemed so powerfully important to us in ways that made me say, I'm not going to watch people's heads being bashed in on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in my country without doing something about it. And I think when you're 17 or 18 years old, you feel a certain invulnerability. I feel much more vulnerable now. I would just be in a panic if my own child said she was going to do that. But for me, the kind of moral imperative of this was so compelling that there was no choice. It was the only choice to make. And so I felt privileged during college to have things that I could care that much about and that I could relate to what I was studying. And I felt learning about the American past helped me. I was a history major as an undergraduate, helped me to understand where these currents of American life had come from and how I might intervene in them later on in my life. So the intertwining of my commitments, I guess political commitments, moral commitments, one might call them, and my intellectual life were extraordinarily powerful and meaningful to me.
I mean, certainly student activism presumably causes you a certain amount of headaches in your job, but do you, given your own past, do you sort of encourage more students to engage in that kind of activism to give you more headaches? I mean, is that something you encourage?
I have tremendous admiration for students who are engaged in the wide range of ways in which they embrace the challenges of the world. I don't always find it easy to respond to. It seems like a kind of just desserts for me in a sense to be on the other side of this now, to be trying to maintain an institution in its daily life amidst the kinds of passions that level of engagement can engender. But I have great admiration for the students who take on these causes and want a better world, because we need people with that kind of passion. We felt, I think, for many decades that there hasn't been that level of student engagement, and we're seeing it return in important ways in recent years, and I think we should all embrace that.
In a moment, I had some questions from people about divestment, but let me, and that...
Sure, we can talk about that.
But let's actually come back to that in the latter part where we're kind of dealing with questions from the audience. One of the things that when I was asking people what issues to raise, one of the things that came up was fundraising, the capital campaign. And one of the things I heard a lot was, well, you know, why does Harvard need all that money? And obviously it's perceived as this incredibly wealthy institution. It's a little known fact that Drew actually keeps the entire endowment in this big box in her office, full of cash. And you know, if we were to send over for it right now, that would be presumably around $32 million for each of us right here, and we could just blow it all. But given this, the fact that we are a wealthy institution, so how is that, the money that is raised, how will that improve life here at Harvard? How will that improve academics here at Harvard? Well,
we are very blessed to have this endowment, which friends and supporters of the university have helped us accumulate over the many decades and centuries of Harvard's existence. We use it as a investment source that gives off funds every year that fund about 35% of the activities of the university. So the principal stays there in the box, which is actually downtown at HMC, Harvard Management Company, not under my desk. And we spend every year that amount that is made by the investment of that capital. So what we're doing now requires the continual generation of that income in order to sustain it, whether it's endowed faculty positions or financial aid for students or any of the myriad of things that it funds. If we want to do new things, we have to have other sources to find for support for those new things. And that's what the capital campaign's about. Now, if you think about the magnificent gift that we got last week, $350 million for what is now to be the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Here is a school in an area of such importance to the world, as Ebola underscores at this very moment. And did you see on the front page of your newspaper on Sunday a story about a hero in Liberia who has a degree, an MPH, from the School of Public Health? So we can see the ways in which the School of Public Health makes such an enormous difference in the world. Yet that has been a seriously underfunded school, and we'll now be able to provide more support for students to come from all over the world to learn the techniques and insights of public health. We can fund more research. We can do remarkable things that are going to have a hugely positive effect on the world because of that gift. So when we see what we're not able to do now and what we can make possible through this fundraising, that I believe is the justification and logic and aspiration of the campaign.
I think that the reason some people were asking that is that some people flinch at the idea of appearing too kind of money grubbing or money focused. And I share with you that, I mean, I think the School of Public Health is transformative on so many people's lives all over the world. The work they do on global public health, the work they've done.
You must see this on
I see
your
it all the
travels.
time. Issues like my gun control. I mean, the best work on addressing gun deaths and injuries in this country is probably by David Hemingway over at the School of Public Health. And there are so many issues where it's so important, and yet, but there is this ambivalence that we have about, on the one hand, the idea that we need to raise more money so this school can have more impact, and so that the whole institution can have more impact, but also some discomfort, I think, that we have with a focus on fundraising, on money, and in a sense, I mean, obviously Harvard itself was named for a donor, Sanders Theater was named for a donor, but do you see trade-offs that keep you up at night, that are uncomfortable about the need to raise money and compromises that you have to make?
As you were speaking, I was thinking about the many organizations that you cite often in your column, and you say, here's an important problem that I see, and here's some way that you can help it. And those organizations tend to be more on the ground than Harvard University, more in the midst of the particular problem out in the field, often smaller, less established, less institutionalized. And they are, I don't know all of them, but I assume, and the ones I do know, they are wonderful organizations, very deserving of philanthropic support. But I think Harvard also is, for people with their philanthropic dollars, I would say, think about all the ways in which you can have an impact. Harvard is different from those organizations you name. We've been around longer, we're bigger, we're more institutionalized, we're wealthier. But we also can do some very extraordinary things. And so persuading people of that, giving them the opportunity to do that, inspiring them to do that, and then seeing the results of it is very, very gratifying. And when I see students at the scholarship dinner every year, for example, who meet with the people who have funded their scholarships and talk about what their experience at Harvard has been like, the way in which those connections are electrifying is memorable. And so I feel good about enabling that kind of work, those kinds of connections, and that kind of philanthropy. I don't think it should be the only kind of philanthropy, but I think it's a very important kind.
And I've got to say that even those people at those little micro-organizations, so many of them came through the Kennedy School or the School of Public Health or the college or wherever it may be. I remember one time in South Sudan in the Nuba Mountains, we were, a group of us, there was terrible malnutrition, and we're being bombed by the Sudanese authorities, and I'm making small talk with a South Sudanese man there, and he starts talking about 1737 Cambridge Street, and we have this long, he'd been to Harvard, and it had very much shaped his view of things. So it is indeed, the investments here do have their influence in echoes and reverberations all over the world.
That reach and that impact.
That have that impact all over. One issue that has been in the news a lot around the country and here at Harvard has been sexual violence. And Harvard is indeed undertaking efforts to try to address this. Do you feel that the efforts that the university is making as a whole are affecting the way things are actually unfolding on Saturday nights on the campus, and that it is making a difference in keeping students safer at parties, that it is, that there is an impact from those meetings that is actually leaving students safer and resulting in less impunity in actual daily student life.
There's certainly been a huge consciousness raising on the part of everyone across the campus, I would say, as a beginning to your beginning of a response to your question. Sexual violence has no place on this campus. It is at complete odds with the kind of openness and trust and safety that ought to be the hallmark of a university community. So it behooves us to do everything possible to combat it. We have revised our Title IX policy. We have done a number of things. But in my mind, one of the most important approaches is to make sure it doesn't happen in the first place. And that realm of prevention is one in which we are investing a lot of energy and attention with a task force led by former Provost Steve Hyman that I appointed last spring, with a double focus on prevention and then taking care of those who have experienced sexual assault. Part of your question suggests to me the significance of what this task force is doing in terms of trying to get data to enable it to have the impact that we want, to make sure that what we're doing is having the kinds of outcomes. Is the training program that we've put in place the best possible one? What can we learn from other institutions about what training programs have worked to prevent sexual assault? How do we evaluate the effectiveness of these? So I think the intentions are powerful and mobilized. We are going to have to make sure that they result in the kinds of changes that we are seeking. So I would say, yes, we've had an impact in that people are so much more aware of this, and that is a beginning, but we have lots more to do in making sure that the different programs that we introduce are having the most powerful effect possible.
At some institutions, I think some women feel that these incidents are an embarrassment to the institution, and that as a result, the institution doesn't particularly want to investigate or report it to the authorities or count it, because it's easier, especially where there is some ambiguity, just to kind of tell everybody to move on. Is that an issue? Do you feel confident that if there is some such incident here and it is reported, that it will be investigated, that it will be dealt with?
The last thing on our mind ought to be whether it's an embarrassment or not for the institution. We need to care about the people involved. We need to take care of those who have been involved and prevent others from having to be involved in such situations. That is our absolute fundamental goal and purpose. And if there are those or incidents where people who feel that it's an embarrassment, or incidents where people act as if it is, I think we have to combat that and make clear that that is not an acceptable way to operate at Harvard.
In a sense, that goes to the whole issue of inclusiveness at Harvard. And one other issue of inclusiveness that got a lot of attention earlier this year was the I2M Harvard campaign. And the perception among African Americans in particular, but also I think among some other underrepresented minorities, that they were not fully embraced by Harvard institution, by the people of Harvard. What can one do to try to address this, to try to create a greater atmosphere of inclusiveness?
I2M Harvard was a very powerful, dramatic presentation, which sent a signal to us and to universities beyond our walls as well, about how diversifying the community is not the same thing as creating an inclusive community. And we need to do both things. We need to make sure we have a diverse population, because that's how we learn the most from one another. That's what our values are. But we also have to ensure that people who come here into this very diverse environment can fully take advantage of what's here and are feel fully members of the community. So how do we do that? How do we begin to accomplish that? That's very much a question in our minds right now. One of the things the I Too Am Harvard students asked me to do was make statements about why diversity is important, make statements about why excellence and diversity go hand in hand, make statements about inclusion. And I've done a number of those in the course of the last several months, a column in the Harvard Magazine, remarks I made at Convocation, a talk I gave at morning prayers, to say these are the values of our community and to have a leadership signal. In the college and in the various parts of the university, there are a number of different committees and inquiries going on. Jonathan Walton, professor of the Divinity School and the minister in Memorial Church, is leading such a committee in the college, talking about what are the programs, actions, activities that we can introduce that can turn this message into a set of actions that have results in the community. So we're very engaged with this, and I hope we will, and you as overseers will hear some of the outcomes of those conversations to know the actions we can take.
Does it feel like you're making headway?
Well, I hope that these messages are being heard and are being taken in by the individuals who are hearing them. I think, once again, raising the issue, as with sexual assault, is an important first step. We have to recognize that we are not where we want to be in order to start the movement to try to get to where we want to go. And that I would say is an important part of what we're doing right now.
There's another kind of diversity, if you will, that we tend not to think about or talk about, but I wonder if you think it should be an issue. That's political diversity, that Harvard and indeed most academic institutions, especially in the major cities, tend to be quite liberal, and I mean that's my world. But I must say that I do wonder whether a conservative, evangelical Christian Republican from the South would feel uncomfortable coming here, whether there's a risk that self-selection would keep people out of applying or coming in ways that would undermine the diversity of the Harvard experience and the educational experience that they would bring to other students. Is that something that we should think about, mm-hmm. either for faculty or for students, and how do we create inclusiveness for those who have kind of different belief structures?
This is a very important issue for us. At Convocation this year, there was a student speaker, and she got up and talked about being a Republican, among other messages she sent. She had been working on a gubernatorial primary campaign during the summer. She was a very active, engaged political individual, and talked about her party affiliation. I thought that sent a message. I hope that sent a message to the assembled students that there is a diversity of political views at Harvard, that not everybody thinks one way or the other way. We had at commencement last year a talk by Michael Bloomberg, who cited the, what should we call it, shutdown of various commencement addresses because of protests by different groups at a number of colleges or universities. And I was very proud because he gave a shout out to our Dean of the School of Education, who had resisted such pressures and had insisted that someone whose views were not necessarily shared by the entire student body should have the right to speak, and would have the right to speak at the closing exercises of the Graduate School of Education. We support this very actively here at Harvard, the right to speak, the right not to be shouted down, the right to express your views. And we try to turn it into a broader set of conversations. For example, at the Kennedy School, you see such a range of individuals who are part of the lecture series there, and undergraduate students involved through the Institute of Politics, with fellows who represent every part of the political spectrum. So we try to be activist in support of this sort of diversity and the range of voices that we think are essential for an education. If you only hear one side of things, you're not going to understand how to defend your own side, much less to reach out to those who are in a different place.
Presumably that should not become an issue in faculty hiring, though. I mean,
Faculty hiring is meant to be based on intellectual quality. We try to rigorously challenge that through a whole elaborate set of procedures and processes, resulting in a final decision at an ad hoc committee that takes 3 hours and about 15 people's participation. So we try to penetrate through political valences that may affect hiring decisions in that way. The law school, for example, you've probably recognized there have been a wide range of voices in the law school, and Elena Kagan reached out very widely to include people of all persuasions during the hiring spree in which she was involved in rebuilding the faculty. And Martha Minow has certainly followed in the same path and brought in also many different sorts of speakers. Some of the members of the Supreme Court who'd been a little afraid to come back to Harvard have come. John Roberts was here, Clarence Thomas was here. I think that there's been a celebration of Scalia's anniversary of service on the court. So we've had wide-ranging voices in that way.
That's great. Tell me a little bit about, are you troubled at all that the whole model of higher education, that the business model is in trouble, that costs have been rising so quickly for so long for higher education in a way that can't continue indefinitely? And do we have to kind of rethink how higher education in America is going to be delivered? Maybe MOOCs are part of that. And I mean, how is that going to change the way universities function in America? Well,
it's an enormous challenge, and one that we have tried to address at the undergraduate level through a very generous financial aid policy that is made possible by our endowment and by the ways in which alumni and others have supported us, so that students whose families make less than $65,000 a year make no parental contribution. So we feel that we've combated the price of higher education, but that's not the cost of higher education. Across the nation, I just want to underscore that part of the rising price of higher education has resulted from the withdrawal of state support from many public institutions of higher education. About 25% less per student now is available from the state of California for California institutions than was 15 years ago. So part of that cost issue here is taxation issues and budget issues. But the question you raise has more fundamental realities inside it as well, which is how do we deliver education in a way that is more cost effective and efficient? I think thinking about digital technology is one of those questions, asking ourselves always, is this additional bell or whistle something that is essential, or is it simply adding to what many have called the cost disease of higher education? So this is a matter of enormous concern for all of us. I don't think we have any easy answers to it yet, but it's a matter of something that we all are thinking hard about and trying to discern answers to.
We have a bunch of questions that have come in through email or through cards that people have written down. Let me turn it over to them. Ben Franta from GSAS says, for over 2 years, students, faculty, and alumni have urged Harvard to end its investments in fossil fuels. What is your view on the growing fossil fuel divestment movement now active around the world?
So I'd first refer back to some of our remarks earlier, talking about the passion that students have demonstrated in this area and the welcome, my welcome embrace of the notion of students who are engaged in caring so much about the world. I also think about when I first became president and a group of students came to me and said, we need to do something about our own fossil fuel consumption here on this campus, and I worked with them in ways that led to our sustainability efforts at Harvard and the reduction of our own greenhouse gas consumption. So student activism is very important, and climate change is one of the most enormously challenging issues of our time. I disagree on means here with them. I think divestment is not the direction towards making a difference on the climate issue. I think that our research, our teaching are fundamental to that effort, and that that's the best contribution universities can make in this realm. So I disagree with Ben, who I know well, about the divestment question, but I share a lot of common ground with him, admiring his passion and devotion to this issue, and also recognizing how very important it is that we make progress against climate change.
And you reject divestment as a means because it would be ineffective?
Well, for a variety of reasons. Let me say more about that. I don't think it'll have an impact on changing the behavior of the fossil fuel companies. I think it also is an issue that poses dangers to universities. Our endowment has been given to us for a very specific purpose, which is to fund the education and teaching mission. Those who have given it gave it with that understanding. It is not a political tool, which the divestment advocates explicitly ask me to use it as. Universities are blessed with a nonprofit status and the exemption from certain kinds of requirements in society and the permission to have other kinds of freedoms because they are seen as outside the political realm, as nonpartisans, as not-for-profits. So when we start challenging that apolitical, non-political status, I think we risk some of the privileges that have been granted to us and some of the foundations for people's trust in our judgments of being above political partisanship. In Washington last year, there was a proposal for tax reform that suggested that endowments should be taxed. I think that if we start using our endowments as political tools, we play right into that. So for a variety of reasons, ranging from what is the appropriate use of an endowment to what is the effective way to oppose climate change, I don't think that divestment is what we should be focused on.
There's a question from Alice Morgan that goes to part of the point you just made. She says, elite universities are under attack from all sides, notably for keeping the elite elite. What do you say to this criticism, and how can institutions such as Harvard have more of a transformative impact on the deserving needy?
It's a great question, and it's one closely related to your issues of cost and accessibility. We have changed the profile of our undergraduate student body significantly over the last decade with the Harvard Financial Aid Initiative. We have increased the numbers and percentage of our class on Pell Grants, increased the percentage of those with incomes under $65,000 a year so that they now make up 20% of the freshman class. So trying to provide opportunity in that way is critical. But we also have a School of Education that's working on the supply issue, in a sense, and trying to address issues of equity in K-12 education in the United States. We have people working on issues, and also in our economics department, we have a number of people working on education. Students from lower income families tend to undermatch. They choose less demanding colleges than they might qualify for. What are the interventions that we can make, not just reaching out from our admissions office, but changing policy in high schools around the country so that students are encouraged to reach and to come to places like Harvard so we can have a pool and expand those that we bring here from the lower levels of income in our society. How can we also provide through the variety of realms that our institution intersects with, the conditions in which we have a more equal society. School public health also is involved in those kinds of questions, basic health for people throughout American society. In a sense, you're asking the question about inequality in American society and the variety of ways that an institution like Harvard can engage with it. So the law school, Martha Minow, the dean, often says she thinks of the Harvard Law School as a school of justice as well as a school of law. How can law be used in ways to provide equal opportunity, ensure equal opportunity? Same thing with the School of Public Health, same thing with the Kennedy School and its concerns about democracy. Business school, shared prosperity. So I think there are a lot of ways throughout the university that research and engagement has an effect beyond simply what we're doing in terms of bringing individuals into our body of students, even though that is in itself critically important.
One of the things that always troubles me that goes to that is that education should be the best escalator to opportunity, the best escalator out of poverty in America and abroad, and yet in America, the statistics suggest that education tends to be, if anything, a way of stratifying class and possibly even amplifying the whole education system, of amplifying inequality. The U.S. is one of the few countries where low-income kids get less spent on their education than wealthier kids, how does legacy fit into that? It's something that I'm deeply ambivalent about, because I believe deeply that there is something to be said for a sense of community. On the other hand, it does trouble me that kids with legacy who probably have an advantage already get a second finger on the scales. I love the sense of community that creates, but I am troubled at the implications for inequality that also creates.
What we see in our applicant class is that, well, first of all, about 12% of the student body is legacies.
Of undergraduates.
And they do get in at a higher rate than non-legacy students. But if you look at their statistics are also, like their SATs and their GPAs and so forth. They're children of Harvard graduates who have had advantages in life and often are financially very comfortable, and themselves once got into Harvard, even if it was easier then. So
rub it in.
So these children are ones that have usually performed very well. And we turn down many more legacy students than we accept. So it can be a tip in a situation where a student is strong and qualified, and another student equally strong and qualified has to be selected. You have to compare them. So I think the sense of community is important. We feel it with families. You feel it, I'm sure. But I wouldn't exaggerate the impact it has on differentiating among students.
Jim F. Young says, how does the president see the role of online education evolving at the graduate, undergraduate, and high school levels? And I mean, just to add on to that, at some point down the road, not too far away, are students going to be, by and large, going to be going to lecture classes, on their laptops, and then basically classes are going to be discussion? Is that the direction we're moving?
That's one direction that I see things moving, as the sage on the stage gets replaced by people who are much more actively involved in classes and have consumed the lecture part of their experience beforehand. We've seen so many changes here, even in the past 3 years, as we've begun experimenting with online learning through edX and HarvardX, as we try out different modes of delivering content, think about new questions. For example, when you have online teaching, it doesn't matter how long a semester is. We just had a China X course that lasted for 15 months. That was one taken around the world. It grew out of a course that has been offered on campus, but it could have a length that was different. We've also gotten a lot of interest, we've developed a lot of interest in modules, very short little nuggets of information that might be inserted into a face-to-face class to amplify a particular part of that course, but are not the same length as courses. So we begin to ask questions about everything we do as we experiment with what's made possible by online learning. It's a pedagogical gadfly, in a sense, because nothing that you took for granted almost nothing needs to be taken for granted any longer. So I can't answer what it's going to look like, because we keep discovering what it's going to look like. It will enable much more active learning. It will enable much more global learning, whether that means taking our courses and sharing them around the world, or sitting here and having someone from Shanghai ask the question of you or me about what the next element of the course should be directed towards. So we can have simultaneous participation by people around the world through digital and online means. It's going to be very different to talk about the trolley problem, the morality of whether you run the trolley over the person in front of you or divert it and save that person's life and kill someone else. It's 3 people versus 1 person. I would think that you would find very different sets of assumptions in different cultures. How does that change everything we do? So many of these questions. There was an online course on intellectual property that was taught in different ways simultaneously from the law school last year, live on campus, as a 500-person semi-MOOC. It wasn't massive. It was 500 people with law students acting as teaching fellows. It was in a classroom in Jamaica with the online part, but people gathered together. And by looking at how it was consumed in these different contexts, we could compare and contrast in ways that we just wouldn't be able to understand if we could do the same kind of teaching all the time. So the question was also about high school and elementary school. We're making our materials available much more widely than simply college, and so I think these are not in any way restricted to university level. Though what we've seen with most of our MOOCs is that they're taken by people who have college degrees or are older, and that has been there's a huge variety, but the largest group of participants are people who have some education and are trying to go beyond that.
And does this turn Harvard into an international institution in a way? I mean, colleges have been experimenting with overseas campuses with some mixed success, but MOOCs, in a sense, create an international repository of learning that anybody can access from anywhere.
It's important to understand that it's not just one way, that people are very active in determining how they learn and what their learning is going to mean, so that we hear back from people in these courses. They talk to one another. They try to gather physically in Mumbai or Mongolia. And so it's an interactive process. In this law school course, the participation of people in Jamaica who were concerned about the intellectual property of reggae brought new perspectives to this, and as well as I think the Italian Minister of Culture was taking that course, people all over the world. The students in Harvard Law School learned so much about intellectual property internationally that they never would have seen in a course that was just for Harvard Law School. So we're all learning. It's both ways, and that's what global education ought to be, not simply our projecting our notion of what our learning is outwards, but also taking back the different perspectives and different understandings, both of the material in the course and the process of the course.
Aaron Lang asks, is there any concern among Harvard staff about the number of students who graduate and go on to Wall Street? Or consulting, presumably.
When I was named president in the winter of 2007, and I began to meet with students, what they said to me again and again was, why are we all going to Wall Street? And I found this such a curious way to phrase the question, as if someone was, handcuffing them and sending them to Wall Street. And so it's been a question very much on my mind ever since. Now, the financial crisis changed things a bit. There were years when the number of recruits went sharply downward, and many students felt this was not the world for them after they saw the crisis firsthand. But it's been my commitment to try to widen the range of choice for students and say, look, there are lots of other things to do. We approve of all these other things. We encourage a wide range of things. Find what matters to you. Find what is going to be fulfilling. Don't feel as if you've been shipped off to Wall Street against your will, which is how many of these students were phrasing it to me. The recruitment process for Wall Street is so powerful in that there's a kind of juggernaut that begins with summer jobs after sophomore and junior year, and then firms in finance and consulting descending on the campus and offering certainty to anxious seniors by the middle of the fall term, middle to end of the fall term. It's an easy path to follow, and a lot of Harvard undergraduates are very good at applying for things. So how can we open up pathways more widely? I think Teach for America understood that, and the Teach for America pathway is also very well understood and one that's not hard to follow. So there's a nice alternative that about 20% of our students apply to every year. So that is a very popular choice. How can we point the way more effectively for students to go to other kinds of job choices and other kinds of service and engagement in their lives? And so that I think is the key for us, and we've done a certain amount of had a certain amount of success at that, but we need to continue to push at it.
So you're perfectly happy with students who choose to go to Wall Street. You just don't want them that to become kind of the default option where they end up there almost by accident, by mistake.
I want people to understand what the variety of choices they have could be. This goes back to your very first question. Do people feel they have to go to Wall Street because they think they won't ever survive financially if they don't choose that path in life? We need to broaden options by encouraging people to take humanities courses the minute they get to Harvard. This is a broad approach to making more options available, and I think for those who want to go to Wall Street, who find that fulfilling, who really see that as their role in life, that's the choice they should make. But I think a lot of students are doing it almost because they can't figure out what another choice would be, or they're frightened to risk another choice.
We need you in journalism too. Don't forget journalism. I'm afraid we're almost out of time, so let me ask one last question. And there are a bunch of good ones here, but there are several that relate to women at Harvard, to gender. Valeria Tiffer, who's an LLM candidate, asks, as the first woman to serve as president, which do you consider the challenges that women face during college, and any advice for women here?
Where do I start? So the challenges women face in general, is that how she framed this?
During college.
During college. I think there are a combination of issues that I would want to underscore. Don't underestimate yourself. I just saw a survey from the freshman class, and there were a variety of parts of that survey that showed women were expecting less of themselves than men in terms of how much money they'd make or how aspirational they wanted to be. So reach. Don't be afraid to reach. Understand that this is not a gender-free world, in that you will find obstacles or people who treat you in certain ways or people who have certain expectations of you because you're a woman. Your aggression in women is greeted much more negatively than in men, for example, and it's over-interpreted, I think, in women. So don't be surprised when that happens, but reach high. That would be my advice. Don't be discouraged, reach high. I did a video, run for undergraduate council. I did a video telling women to run for undergraduate council. Run for everything, try everything. That would be it. So, you have a new book. And so let me ask you a question. Tell us
Tables turned.
Yes, tables turned. What advice would you give to women? No.
Buy the book.
Buy the book. That's good. Good advice. Tell us about the new book. Tell us about the process of creating it, and tell us about the hopes you have for it. Nick's last book was about women, so I was only partly kidding when I asked him.
So that was from a Chinese saying that women hold up half the sky. This is from another Chinese saying from Lu Xun, that hope is like a path in the countryside. At first there is nothing, and then because people walk this way again and again, a path appears. And so the title is A Path Appears, and it's kind of about how to make a difference. So it's very much the kinds of issues we've been talking about. It's probably not all that different from things a lot of students at the Kennedy School are studying. And I think my wife and I, Cheryl Wudun, and I wrote it together, and I think there are a few reasons why this project meant a lot to us. One is that there is a lot of discussion in this country about inequality, and we talked about that here and how we can address that. And it seems to me that while there is some agreement that inequality is a problem, there's zero consensus on what to do about it. And I think that maybe the word inequality scares particularly people on the right, and opportunity is often, I think, a more successful word, that inequality of outcomes galvanize people much less. I think inequality of opportunity is something that, I mean, one poll found 97% of Americans agreeing that that was a real problem, that we should do more to create more access to the starting line. And 97% of Americans don't agree on anything. They don't agree the world is round. So that was a real, it seems to me that pushing for more opportunity is something where there is a political opportunity to achieve more, and I think that is kind of how we can create a more just and equal society to some degree, focusing on that opportunity side. And I guess the second reason is when we wrote Half the Sky and when we were talking about it, people would always ask Cheryl or me, so what do we do? And we wanted to answer that question. About 2/3 of Americans donate to charity or volunteer each year, and often I think we know it's not very effective. And there really is an evidence base that has been emerging in the last 20 years, and a lot of it built up by scholars here. Michael Kramer in the economics department was one of the first people to do really careful randomized controlled trials to look at poverty interventions as if they were pharmaceutical trials. And we've really learned things now about what works, what doesn't work, so one can go beyond just good intentions and not just measure inputs, but actually measure outputs. And so we wanted to kind of give that research to those people who are volunteering or are donating. And I guess the last reason is that we really wanted to encourage people, and maybe particularly students, to get engaged with these causes and to understand that there are real selfish pleasures to engaging in some of these causes, that we start out thinking we're going to empower people half a world away, and we end up realizing that it's a lot harder to help people. Helping people is harder than it looks, but invariably one does end up empowering oneself. And the research on this is just, sort of astonishing. That there was actually some of it was done here in Harvard Square. There were some people from the business school who were giving out $20 bills randomly to people in Harvard Square and asking them to either spend it on others or to spend it on themselves that day. And everybody thought that they would derive more happiness if they spent it on themselves. And in fact, when they called up later, those randomly assigned to spend it on others, it really kind of made their day. And we now understand the neuroscience of that a little bit, that the nucleus accumbens, which is one of the pleasure centers of the brain, it just lights up when you are engaged in some kind of altruistic action. So, sometimes I've heard from students that, the first third of one's life should be spent studying, and the middle third making money, and the last third giving back. And I think if you do that, you're just cheating yourself. That finding some way of connecting to a cause larger than yourself and doing that in a social way and trying to make a difference in the world, I think is a really powerful and primal selfish pleasure that one can derive tremendous satisfaction from, and we wanted to encourage people to do that.
As you speak about this, I think to myself about the variety of subjects we discussed, and my wish for Harvard would be that for those who come to Harvard, it would be a place where a path appears, that it would be somewhere that you would find what that passion was, what that way of connecting was, or how you could take the way you already knew and enhance it in ways that would give it more impact. So
my path appeared when I was here, and I'm sure a lot of you guys did too.
Thanks so much, Nick, and thanks for everything you do in the world.
Thanks so much.